What if the man hailed as the savior of the Western Desert was actually moments away from a catastrophe that would have handed the keys of Egypt to the Desert Fox? The shimmering heat of the El Alamein line in October 1942 was not just a physical barrier of sand and salt pans, but a psychological precipice where the reputation of General Bernard Montgomery hung by a fraying thread as his meticulously planned operation, Lightfoot, began to grind into a bloody, stagnant nightmare. If you find value in these deep dives into the turning points of history, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. For 3 days, the greatest artillery barrage since the First World War had failed to shatter the crust of the Axis defenses, leaving the British 8th Army tangled in a devil's garden of millions of mines while the German 15th Panzer Division prepared to counterattack. Montgomery, often perceived as a man of icy confidence and rigid adherence to schedule, found himself in the claustrophobic confines of his command caravan, staring at maps that told a story of stalled tanks and mounting casualties that threatened to repeat the disasters of his predecessors. The pressure from London was immense, with Winston Churchill pacing the floors of Downing Street, desperate for a victory to justify the diversion of American-made Sherman tanks to the North African theater. By October 25th, the optimistic atmosphere of the initial breakthrough had evaporated, replaced by the grim realization that the corridors meant for the armor were not clear, and the infantry of the 51st Highland Division was being decimated in the Kidney Ridge sector. The tension within the 8th Army's high command reached a boiling point as Montgomery summoned his subordinates, including the cautious Herbert Lumsden of the 10th Armored Corps and Oliver Leese of 30th Corps, to a midnight conference that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean. It was in this moment of near collapse that Montgomery uttered words that betrayed the immense weight on his shoulders, admitting that if the armor did not push through regardless of the cost, the entire offensive would have to be abandoned, a concession that would have ended his career and perhaps the British presence in the Middle East. He stood before his generals, his voice thin but resolute, declaring that he would not tolerate a crumbling process that favored the enemy, yet he was privately grappling with the terrifying possibility that Erwin Rommel, even in his absence on sick leave, had built a fortress that was truly impenetrable. The desert night was cold, a stark contrast to the burning metal of the tanks, and as the reports of the 2nd Armored Brigade's failure to advance trickled in, the specter of a humiliating retreat loomed over the British camp. Montgomery knew that his plan for a swift knockout blow had failed, and he was now forced into a war of attrition that he had explicitly promised to avoid, a pivot that required him to rewrite his strategy on the fly, while under the scrutiny of a skeptical war cabinet. He paced a small area of his tactical headquarters, ignoring the dust and the distant rumble of the 88mm guns, focused entirely on the logistics of shifting his main effort from the south to the north, a maneuver that many of his officers deemed impossible under fire. As the sun rose over the dunes on the 26th of October, the British found themselves in a precarious salient, with their flanks exposed and their morale wavering as the reality of the German anti-tank screen became tragically clear to the crews of the burning Shermans. Rommel had returned from Germany, his presence immediately felt in the renewed vigor of the Axis counterthrusts, and for the first time, Montgomery's characteristic bravado seemed to falter as he realized he was fighting a genius of maneuver with a dwindling clock. The Lightfoot strategy was dead, and in its place, Montgomery began to conceive Operation Supercharge, but the transition was fraught with the danger of a total collapse if the Germans detected the regrouping of the 7th Armored Division. He spoke to his chief of staff, Freddie de Gingand, in hushed tones about the terrible necessity of sacrificial attacks, acknowledging that he was about to ask his men to charge into a wall of fire just to buy time for a new plan to emerge. This was the true Montgomery, stripped of the press-friendly image of the beret and the 2 badges, a man willing to burn his own reputation and his soldiers' lives to prevent the strategic ruin of the Allied cause. The fields of fire at El Alamein became a graveyard for the 9th Australian Division and the New Zealanders, who fought with a ferocity that Montgomery later admitted was the only thing that kept the front from shattering while he reassessed his blunders. By the midpoint of this grueling struggle, the air was thick with the scent of cordite and the screams of the wounded, and Montgomery realized that his legacy would not be defined by his initial brilliance, but by how he handled this moment of profound failure. If you are captivated by the grit and leadership shown in these historic moments, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. He began to realize that the break-in had failed, and the breakout was a distant dream unless he could convince his exhausted troops to give one more Herculean effort against an enemy that refused to die. The Australian 26th Brigade was pushed into the Saucer, a shallow depression that became a slaughterhouse, yet Montgomery insisted on the pressure, believing that Rommel's fuel reserves were even lower than his own ammunition stocks, a gamble of monumental proportions. He told his staff that the battle had turned into a dogfight, a term that underscored a lack of finesse in the raw, brutal nature of the combat that now characterized the Alamein line. The shift to the north was a desperate move, a literal sliding of the 8th Army's weight, while pinned down, requiring a level of discipline and coordination that few armies in history had ever achieved under such duress. The nights were filled with the ghostly silhouettes of recovery vehicles trying to salvage tanks under the glare of German flares, while Montgomery slept fitfully, knowing that a single major breakthrough by the 21st Panzer Division would roll up his line and drive the British back to the Nile. He was criticized by his own brigadiers for being too detached, yet this detachment was his armor against the mounting casualty list that arrived at his caravan every morning, lists that included friends and sons of his peers. He looked at the maps of the Hill 28 area and realized that he had underestimated the depth of the German minefields, an error that had cost him the momentum he desperately needed to keep the Americans and Churchill satisfied. His strategy had nearly failed because he had planned for a conventional breakthrough in a terrain that allowed for nothing but a slow, grinding demolition of the enemy's strength, a reality he finally accepted during a tense meeting on October 29th. It was here that he demonstrated his greatest strength, the ability to admit a plan was broken and to reform it in the heat of battle without losing the confidence of his men, even as the desert floor was littered with the wreckage of his first attempt. The final push of Supercharge was not a stroke of genius, but a triumph of logistics and sheer willpower, as the British finally broke to the Tel El Akaka Ridge, forcing Rommel into a retreat that would not end until Tunisia. Montgomery's success was built on the ruins of his near failure, a lesson in leadership that teaches us that the greatest commanders are not those who never stumble, but those who can stand up while the world is watching them fall. As the Axis forces began their long withdrawal, Montgomery stood on a ridge overlooking the battlefield. A man transformed by the ordeal, knowing that the end of the beginning had been bought at a price he would remember for the rest of his life. History remembers a victory, but it often forgets the midnight hours when the general sat alone, contemplating the words he would use to explain a defeat that never came to pass only because he refused to blink. If this story of resilience and strategic courage has moved you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. The sheer weight of the transition from Operation Lightfoot to Operation Supercharge cannot be overstated, as it required the movement of thousands of vehicles across a landscape where every track was a potential death trap. Montgomery sat in his command vehicle, the Mammoth, listening to the rhythmic thrum of the radio nets, aware that the 2nd New Zealand Division was now the pivot upon which the entire British Empire's hopes rested. He had seen the reports from the front lines where the 9th Australian Division was being shredded in the Saucer. Yet he ordered them to continue their bloody diversionary attacks to keep Rommel's attention fixed on the coast. It was a cold, calculated sacrifice that haunted the junior officers, but Montgomery remained outwardly stoic, famously telling his staff that they must not bellyache about the plan's adjustments. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and the metallic tang of blood as the 1st Armored Division prepared to run the gauntlet of the German 88mm guns one more time. This was the moment where the strategy had nearly disintegrated. The infantry was exhausted. The tankers were wary of the minefield hysteria, and the command structure was fraying under the relentless pace of the engagement. If you find yourself gripped by this turning point in the Desert War, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. Montgomery knew that if the breakthrough did not happen within the next 48 hours, the arrival of German reinforcements from across the Mediterranean would turn the stalemate into a permanent blockade. He personally visited the headquarters of the 10th Armored Corps, pushing General Lumsden to show more drive, a directive that highlighted the growing friction between the cavalry-minded tank commanders and Montgomery's vision of a unified, grinding machine. The desert night was illuminated by the orange flashes of distant artillery, a constant reminder that for every hour of deliberation, more men were being lost to the unrelenting fire of the Afrika Korps. Rommel, sensing the British hesitation, had begun to concentrate his remaining panzers for a final, decisive counterstrike that could have decapitated the Eighth Army's lead elements. It was a race against time, a battle of logistics and nerves where the margin for error had narrowed to nothing, and Montgomery's reputation as a lucky general was about to be tested in the most brutal crucible imaginable. By November 2nd, 1942, the opening of Operation Supercharge saw the British armor finally lashing out against the Italian and German screens at Tel el-Akakar. The carnage was absolute. The 9th Armor Brigade lost nearly 80% of its tanks in a single morning, charging into the sun and the waiting barrels of the German anti-tank guns. Montgomery, receiving these reports, did not flinch, realizing that the crust of Rommel's defense was finally cracking under the immense pressure of the British material superiority. He had shifted the focus of the battle just enough to catch the Desert Fox off balance, utilizing the very crumbling tactics he had once feared would take too long. The German lines, stretched to the breaking point and starved of fuel, began to show the first signs of a systematic collapse as the 51st Highland Division cleared the final obstacles. Montgomery's speech to his officers changed from one of grim determination to one of predatory focus, as he sensed the enemy was finally getting a bit thin on the ground. The crisis had passed, not through a single stroke of genius, but through the relentless application of pressure and the willingness to adapt a failing plan into a winning one. Exactly at the midpoint of this narrative, we see the shift from a desperate defense of a strategy to the execution of a pursuit that would change the course of the Second World War. If you are inspired by the resilience shown during these dark hours of leadership, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. Rommel's famous order from Hitler to stand and die arrived just as the British tanks began to pour through the gap, creating a logistical and moral crisis for the German command. Montgomery, now firmly in control of the battlefield's tempo, refused to let the momentum slip away, ordering his armored cars to fan out into the enemy's rear to sow chaos. The sight of the retreating Axis columns, a tangled mess of trucks and retreating infantry, was the ultimate vindication of the risks Montgomery had taken when his strategy was on the verge of failure. He had transformed a potential disaster into the first clear-cut British land victory of the war, a feat that would forever link his name with the sands of El Alamein. The costs had been high, with over 13,000 British and Commonwealth casualties, but the strategic prize was the safety of the Suez Canal and the beginning of the end for the Axis in Africa. As the sun set over the liberated ridges, Montgomery sat in his caravan and wrote in his diary about the magnificent performance of his troops, though he privately acknowledged how close they had come to a stalemate. He had learned that a plan is only as good as a commander's ability to scrap it when the reality of the terrain and the enemy's resolve dictates a new path. The victory at El Alamein was not just a triumph of steel, but a triumph of psychological endurance, proving that the Eighth Army could outfight the most celebrated tactical mind of the Third Reich. Montgomery emerged from the desert as a national hero, but the lessons of those 10 days in the Devil's Garden stayed with him through the campaigns in Sicily, Italy, and ultimately Normandy. He would never again underestimate the difficulty of a break-in operation, and his future strategies would always bear the mark of the caution he learned when his Lightfoot plan nearly crumbled in the sand. The world remembered the victory, but the desert remembered the blood and the moments of doubt that preceded the glory. The legacy of what Montgomery said and did when his strategy nearly failed serves as a timeless study in the art of command under extreme duress. It reminds us that history is not a series of inevitable events, but a collection of choices made by fallible men in the heat of the moment. The Spartan general had faced his greatest fear, a repeat of the psalm in the sand, and had found a way to win without breaking the spirit of his army. As we look back at the maps of 1942, we see more than just arrows and lines. We see the weight of a world at war resting on the shoulders of a man who refused to accept defeat. If this deep dive into the reality of wartime leadership has resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. Your engagement helps us continue to tell these essential stories of our shared past, ensuring that the lessons of El Alamein are never forgotten by future generations. The pursuit across the scorched plains of Libya became a testament to the fact that Montgomery had not only survived a strategic crisis, but had been forged anew by it, as he now directed the Eighth Army with a level of clinical precision that left the retreating Afrika Korps little room to breathe. The road to Mersa Matruh was littered with the charred remains of the once feared panzers, yet Montgomery remained haunted by the narrowness of his success, knowing that the Lightfoot phase had been a trial by fire that nearly consumed his entire command. He spent hours reviewing the performance of the 10th Armored Corps, realizing that the bridgehead he had struggled to establish was the most dangerous moment of his career, a realization that prompted him to demand even higher standards of training and coordination for the battles yet to come. If you find value in these deep dives into the turning points of history, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. The general's focus now shifted to the logistical nightmare of maintaining a 1,000-mile supply line, a task that required the same meticulous attention to detail that saved him at El Alamein when the ammunition stocks had dipped to critical levels. He moved his headquarters forward, always staying close enough to front to feel the pulse of the battle, yet distant enough to maintain the objective clarity of thought he prized above all else. The relationship between Montgomery and his desert veterans, the Desert Rats, was solidified during this period of relentless advance, as the men saw that their commander was prepared to admit his errors and quiet his caravan while presenting a face of absolute certainty to the world. He understood that the psychological impact of the victory was as important as the territorial gains, sending regular updates to Churchill that were designed to bolster the morale of a British public weary of years of defeat. However, behind the confident communiques lay a man who was constantly analyzing the what-ifs, specifically how close Rommel had come to piercing the Australian sector during the height of the October stalemate. The shifting sands of Cyrenaica Bulge offered new tactical challenges, but Montgomery refused to be drawn into the kind of impulsive, high-speed maneuvers that had led to the downfall of his predecessors like Cunningham and Ritchie. He insisted on balance, a term that became his mantra, ensuring that his infantry, artillery, and armor were always positioned to support one another, preventing the Axis from finding a single weak point to exploit. By the time the Eighth Army reached the Agila bottleneck in December 1942, the world was watching to see if Montgomery would stumble where others had failed before, facing a dug-in enemy in a naturally formidable defensive position. The ghost of his near failure at the Alamein minefields guided his hand as he planned a wide-out flanking maneuver with the 2nd New Zealand Division, a move that reflected his newfound willingness to combine brute force with strategic elegance. He told his staff that they would hit the enemy for 6, using a cricket metaphor that masked the deep anxiety he felt about the possibility of another costly war of attrition. The tension at Agila was a microcosm of the entire North African campaign, a game of cat and mouse where a single miscalculation could lead to a catastrophic reversal of fortune. Montgomery's ability to remain patient, waiting for his supplies to build up despite pressure from London to get on with it, proved that he had mastered the art of resisting political interference in the interest of military necessity. Exactly at the midpoint of this narrative, we find Montgomery at the height of his influence, having successfully navigated the treacherous transition from a desperate defender to a conquering hero. If you are captivated by the grit and leadership shown in these historic moments, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. He began to look beyond the desert toward the eventual invasion of Europe, carrying with him the hard-won lessons of the Devil's Garden and the importance of having a reserve that can be committed at the decisive moment. The victory in North Africa was finally within his grasp, but he knew that the ultimate test would be the integration of his forces with the arriving American armies under Eisenhower, a political minefield that would prove just as dangerous as the physical ones he had cleared at El Alamein. His strategy had nearly failed because it lacked flexibility, and he spent the final months of the Tunisian campaign ensuring that flexibility was built into every operational order issued by his headquarters. The fall of Tripoli in January 1943 was the culmination of the journey that had begun in those dark, uncertain hours of October, a moment of personal vindication for a man whom many had doubted. Montgomery's entry into the city was not just a military triumph, but a symbolic end to the Italian colonial empire in Africa, a feat that would have been impossible had he not found the inner strength to pivot when his initial plans were shattered. He stood before his troops, a small figure in a sweater and beret, and thanked them for their unconquerable spirit, a spirit that had bridged the gap between his flawed strategy and the ultimate reality of victory. The Desert War was a brutal teacher, and Montgomery was its most diligent student, learning that the true measure of a general is not the brilliance of his first plan, but the courage he shows when that plan is lying in ruins around him. He had faced the Desert Fox and emerged not just a survivor, but a master of the modern battlefield. The narrative of Montgomery at El Alamein is a reminder that even the most meticulously planned operations are subject to the friction of war, and that leadership is often the only force capable of overcoming that friction. It is a story of human fallibility, redeemed by persistence, and of a strategy that nearly failed only to be reborn as a blueprint for the liberation of a continent. As we reflect on the dust and the fire of 1942, we see that the difference between catastrophe and triumph was often found in a few words spoken in a quiet caravan in the middle of the night. If this story of resilience and strategic courage has moved you, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and leave a comment about something you didn't know before or found most interesting. Your support allows us to continue bringing these complex historical truths to light, honoring the memory of those who fought and the commanders who bore the weight of their lives.